Good afternoon. I'm Charles Calhoun, a member of the steering committee for Bristol BookFest 2020, and we're very happy to have you with us today for our program on Robert Penn Warren and his great novel, All the King's Men. It's a beautiful day here in Bristol. I'm sorry we're not able to greet you in person as we had intended to last March, but I think we put together a remarkable virtual program for you. And I can assure you all our speakers cheerfully agreed to participate. Yesterday, we got off to a blazing start. We had more than 100 people joining us, and we heard two really riveting talks by Ernest Suarez and John Burt. Today, we have Alexandra Keller from Smith College with us, and I'm going to introduce her in a few moments, but I just had a few general announcements and reminders. One is that if you did miss yesterday, the presentations will be available on our website, and we will get that information to you how to access them. Also tomorrow, we will be meeting again at the same time, and we'll have a wrap-up session the second hour tomorrow, where we'll have all the presenters together. So if you have any questions that didn't get answered today or that are, occur to you over the evening or whatever, or any comments about any of this, this will be an opportunity for you to participate as well. So please keep that in mind. And at the end of the day, we're going to announce next year's book choice. I think you will be pleased. It isn't 600 pages, but it's a very, very stimulating book, and I think you will enjoy it. So I hope you'll be back next year, because we really do hope this is going to be a permanent feature of the Bristol cultural landscape, and that there will be many, many BookFest in person for many years to come. Just a few other announcements. You'll hear a lot of political opinions expressed probably in the course of these programs. These are the opinions of the speakers or the people asking questions, whatever. They are not in any way an official statement from Bristol BookFest, which is a totally nonpartisan organization, as you can imagine. Let's see, beyond that, I think that if you probably have figured out by now that if you do have questions, you go to the chat room feature on your Zoom page and type in your questions. And we have people who will be forwarding those to me when the time comes to ask them. So just please keep that in mind too. Let me say a little bit about Alex Keller, who is going to talk to us about the film versions of this novel, and more broadly about how Hollywood operated in the 1950s, particularly when the first version of All the King's Men was filmed. When I was a child growing up in northern Louisiana, there was a lot of excitement in 1957 because news got around that a Hollywood film crew was coming into the area. No one was quite sure where, to make a film called Band of Angels. It was based on a best-selling Robert Penn Warren novel of that period, and it starred no less than Clark Gable, Yvonne DiCarlo, and a very young Sidney Poitier. It was a plantation melodrama about a young Kentucky belle who, upon her father's death, discovers that she is part Black and is sold into slavery as a result. And then the rest of the story is how she gets out of that situation. And it was not very well received by the critics. I think it made some money for Robert Penn Warren, certainly, but it was viewed as kind of an attempt to replicate the success of Gone with the Wind, and it just didn't have it. But at any rate, some of the footage for the military scenes, the cavalry charges and whatever, were filmed not too far from where I was in Louisiana. So everyone is still talking about it probably today. It was one of the most exciting things that ever happened there until they started shooting True Blood a few decades later. So in my own mind, growing up, I always had this association of Robert Penn Warren and film. So I was thrilled somewhat later to see the two movie versions and to compare them and their strengths and weaknesses. And I know many of you joined us in the library last winter to talk about the older of the two films. And I think we had 75 people in a very lively discussion. So there's a lot of interest in this notion of how fiction gets transformed into celluloid or today digitized. And we have someone who is a great expert on such things to be with us today. Her main field of interest, I believe, is actually the American Western. But if you've seen the early version of All the King's Men, you know it kind of looks like a Western because it was filmed very much in California as opposed to on location in the Deep South. So I'm very happy to welcome Alex Keller here and turn the program over to her. Thanks, Alex.
All right. I am delighted to be here, such as here is. I want to thank Charles Calhoun for his persistence in keeping us together and moving forward. He knew he had selected an apt book to inaugurate this festival, but none of us could have fully understood how important it would be to offer a public place to think about our current situation in less than the usual ways. This weekend has allowed us to go back in time in order to get out of the mind-numbing chaos of the present so that we may come back to the present and engage with it even more purposefully. This is often the opportunity that the public humanities provides, and it is no less so here today. So I also want to thank my fellow presenters for widening that discourse for us all. If you came here to discuss a film adaptation, I am about to disappoint you. I think it is more productive to talk about source material. Books and films do very different kinds of cultural and social work. Please don't mistake this for an anything goes view of how novels turn into films. I may be traumatized still by Demi Moore's 1995 treatment of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, in which Hester Prynne and Reverend Roger Dimsdale and their illegitimate daughter managed to come out the other side of their trials and tribulations together and alive, if a bit the worse for wear. I don't want Hamlet surviving either. But I am less interested in looking at what has been left in and what has been left out, or whether things have been changed. I am more interested in the fact that a significant literary work that won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction became a significant cinematic work that won the Oscar for Best Picture, and all that may imply. Robert Penn Warren himself saw the film as a completely different animal. He said, "The movie does not mean what I think my book meant. It is Robert Rosson's movie." Asked by Rosson which of several endings he would prefer for the film, Warren didn't think any of them captured the book. It will, in my view, limit the conversation we can have if we stick to questions of fidelity in adaptation. We're better off asking what kind of political work Robert Rosson's All the King's Men seems to have done at the time and how. This will also open us to a conversation about how films that are less overtly political furnish another kind of space for audiences to think about politics and to think politically. However much we can, should, and must talk about literature in the public sphere in a way that this weekend has provided admirably, reading remains, I hope, a private affair. Something that happens between a reader and a text, under a tree, on a subway, next to someone engaged in the same activity. Films during the classical Hollywood period, unlike our own age of binge watching on our tiny devices, were almost always public affairs. We sit alone together in the dark, each having an individual experience with the film, but network together in our collective experience. We laugh together, cry together, are moved and changed together. Even books that are cinematic are not cinema, and we want medium-specific, different things from each. I am stating the obvious perhaps, but it is important to recall that books and films have different capacities. In the classical Hollywood studio era, in which All the King's Men sit squarely, films did their work largely through viewer attachment to stars, genres, and narrative traits that aided and abetted audience identification with characters, with the effect that spectators largely unknowingly took on and replicated the proposed values of any film. There are always negotiations, and systems are rarely watertight. But if Rawson's film wanted to suggest that populism and demagoguery were a going problem for US democracy, that point was neither hard to miss, nor was it produced through a largely intellectual appeal, but instead through a significantly emotional one. I said that we want things from movies, but movies also want things from us. All the King's Men wants to wake us up precisely to the way that politics, particularly populist discourse, are produced through emotional appeals more than rational ones. This is a complex needle to thread. Writer-director Rawson needs to point out and critique that emotional appeal while making recourse to that very logic. The REAL has a very unsteady and slippery relationship to the REEL, and what we take to be realistic ways of presenting the world in film constantly evolve. Conventions of realism change over time, place, and context, and I need to look no further than my own classroom to see my students' reception of films of the 1940s. Films that were received at the time as hard-hitting realism seemed to them at first to be melodramatic treacle until we work together and give them a rigorous unpacking. So here is my plan. I want to frame how All the King's Men works as an overtly political film of its time, and to consider how the cinematic aspects of All the King's Men are integral to its capacity to offer up terms for viewers to engage in real-world politics through fictionally rendered politics. I do this in order to paint a picture of what is available to audiences at any point in US popular culture to activate them, us, as politically aware spectators. There is more than one cinematic treatment of All the King's Men, I know. Stephen Zalian's 2006 remake of All the King's Men stars Sean Penn as Willie Stark, Jude Law as Jack Burton, and Anthony Hopkins, James Gandolfini, Kate Winslet, Patricia Clarkson, Mark Ruffalo, and Jackie Earle Haley as a whole lot of other people whom I ended up caring far less about than I did Broderick Crawford and his pals. It did not win an Oscar for anyone. It was, to me, so sopping in a preloaded prestige that it sagged under its own cachet. But I'm not so interested in whether these films are good or bad. I'm interested in how they work, for whom, and how. And I don't think the second version worked for many because not many even saw it. Back to Rawson's All the King's Men. Here are some easily discerned things about the move from page to screen that bear repeating for our orientation. The film was well received by critics from the New York Times to the trade paper Variety, and All the King's Men was nominated for awards well beyond the Oscars. But there, it was nominated for 7 awards, including Director and Screenplay, both Rawson, Editing, Al Clark and Robert Parrish, and Supporting Actor, John Ireland. It won for Best Actor, Broderick Crawford, Supporting Actress, Mercedes McCambridge for her first film role, and Best Picture, Rawson as producer. In writing that script, Rawson shifted some emphasis from Jack Burton to Willie Stark, with the effect of shifting the affective and political focus more toward Stark's demagogic populism and a critique of domestic anti-democracy. He did this at the very moment that the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was flexing its execrable muscle. That its acronym sounds like a particularly hard to dislodge hairball seems fitting. We think about the Red Scare as having been led by Senator Joe McCarthy, and in retrospect, it would be easy to see Stark as an analog for McCarthy. but HUAC preceded McCarthy, who doesn't give his seminal Enemies Within speech until 1950, after the film came out. Despite not winning, the film's editing was legendary, as Parrish in particular worked with Rawson to wrestle a first cut of over 4 hours down to 109 minutes, which to me anyway, still feels epic. The Oscar speeches are easily accessible on the Academy's website. It's actually kind of fun to do this, but there's not a lot there to report. Speeches were shorter back then, for one thing, but given the chill of the Red Scare, about which more in a moment, speeches used for political critique were, unlike today, few and far between. Because we need a moment for trivia, it's worth pausing on the fact that John Wayne was offered the role of Willie Stark and refused it because the conservative actor found it politically repugnant and would run Robert Rawson down publicly well after Rawson's death. He opted instead for the more routinely patriotic starring role in The Sands of Iwo Jima and lost out to Crawford for the Oscar. If our discussions take us there, we could spend some time on Wayne's post-war career, in which he was increasingly called upon, knowingly or not, to represent people and ideas that were passing out of the political mainstream, especially in the hands of John Ford's 1956's The Searchers, a civil rights allegory, among other things, and Ford's 1962 elegiac Western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. As it happens, The Sands of Iwo Jima did better at the box office that year, and All the King's Men did not crack the top 10. It made $2.4 million. For context, Cecil B. DeMille's Samson and Delilah was #1 and grossed $9 million. If, before World War II, mainstream political anxieties were about fascism, after the war, they shifted decidedly to communism. Rawson's All the King's Men is framed and saturated with Rawson's own experience with the Red Scare and the House Un-American Activities Committee. The Hollywood 10, blacklisted for their actual or alleged connection to the Communist Party, could have been the Hollywood score if the committee hadn't decided to knock off after 10 witnesses, and Rawson, who had been a member of the Communist Party before and during the war, was lucky he was one of the other 9 they didn't get to. If HUAC and its sympathizers were looking for a left-wing aesthetic, Rawson had it in All the King's Men, which mobilized social realist and Italian neo-realist conventions, particularly that of Roberto Rossellini, who directed the extraordinarily influential Rome Open City, which became a touchstone for filmmakers worldwide. This said, Rawson, who had always been identified with the left in Hollywood, found that some of the Hollywood 10 didn't think that the film went far enough in its critique of Stark and Stark's real-life antecedent, Huey Long. The Daily Worker, a New York-based communist newspaper, had described Long as Louisiana's Hitler, and Edward Dmytryk and Ring Lardner Jr. thought Rawson's film was too open-ended in its criticism of Long. Needless to say, the Hollywood right, embodied in but not confined to John Wayne, didn't like it either. I don't think this makes the film centrist by any means, but it does describe the complexities of its creation and reception well. New York-born and raised Rawson, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants, had been known as a social problem-solving screenwriter, addressing racism, fascism, and class politics, sometimes indirectly, in scripts for The Seawolf and The Strange Love of Martha Ivers, a film noir classic, whose legacy is visible in All the King's Men. Rawson had been under contract with Warner Brothers, which he left because, as he put it, he was tired of telling Cinderella stories. In 1947, the same year he temporarily dodged a HUAC bullet, he directed Body and Soul. This was also the year he seems to have cut ties with the Communist Party. To call Body and Soul just a boxing film is either to ignore the politics of the film or else to ignore the politics manifest and latent of every boxing film made after it. Its success allowed Rawson the freedom to do what he wanted at Columbia Pictures. Remember that this is a first-generation Jewish kid from New York, leaving Warner Brothers, headed by someone with a similar identity, and landing at Harry and Jack Cohn's shop. They were also first-generation Jews, so whatever else is happening in these stories, there is an almost invisible framing that can barely speak its name, and in fact, largely wants to efface it. Given the number of Jewish creatives who were forced to leave Europe because of fascism and who came to work in Hollywood, this might matter. So the first wave of Jewish immigrants regularized the film industry and turned it into respectable family entertainment. The next wave push at that and ask films to do more, including more to critique the very US society and democracy that has given them a safer place to be than Hitler's Germany. If under HUAC, dissent was not seen as patriotic, these recent immigrants and other like-minded creatives were producing films that opened doors to that dissent by being analytical, even as they were entertaining, asking who was allowed access to democratic processes, how, and on what grounds. All the King's Men is made in this context. These exiled filmmakers are partly responsible for another aspect of All the King's Men's cinematic style, and that is film noir. It is this style that centrally conveys the politics of the film. Film noir was so named retrospectively by French film critics of the 1950s and 1960s. The French term literally means black or dark film, and the name was given to a broad body of films made between John Huston's The Maltese Falcon in 1941 and Orson Welles' Touch of Evil in 1958. Though Rawson, Huston, and Welles are all born in the US, many of noir's central practitioners, Billy Wilder, Michael Curtiz, and Fritz Lang among them, fled Hitler and came to Hollywood. And that experience of displacement and alienation, as well as the outsider's view of America, was contagious. Noir was so named partly because of its look: high contrast and chiaroscuro lighting, night for night shooting rather than day for night, doom-laden narration, especially in the form of voiceover, compositional tension rather than action in the mise en scène, oblique lines, diagonals, and fractured light. This adds up to a mise en scène which is designed to unsettle the audience in parallel with the disorientation of the protagonists. It becomes an anti-realism in the face of the realist conventions of classical Hollywood studio style. And yet in many ways, it may strike us as more realistic, since the worldview it gives is less simplistic and more connected to the world its original viewers would have been experiencing themselves. That is to say, the realism that had developed through the 1930s since the coming of synchronized sound wasn't cutting it as realism anymore. Gradually, as audiences learned how these visual tropes signified, they became a very popular vocabulary and assumed quite legible thematic connotations. By 1949, audiences knew how to read film noir and for what. The point here is that film noir is a resonant style that crosses genres, one for grown-ups with grown-up problems and wanting a grown-up set of conversations. It is not a genre in itself. As a style, it splays itself across almost all classical Hollywood genres. Its code is so strong, one can see a film as noir, even as it also has a very strong generic identity of its own, like the maternal melodrama and Mildred Pierce, the Western and High Noon, the gangster film and Key Largo, Hitchcock's psychological thriller Notorious, and the Hollywood self-portrait Sunset Boulevard. Genres tell you what's on offer to talk about. Film noir, as a style, tells you how the conversation can be had. A Western that wasn't noir ended with the hero clearly having regenerated the incipient frontier community with his specific kind of violence, after which he might become the new sheriff, or he might just move on to the next town. As High Noon shows us, with Noir, that is not how Westerns end. This is an important distinction, because how the political work of All the King's Men is carried out in its direct address of politics is different from that carried out more allegorically in genres with strong identifying markers of their own. And this brings us to Life magazine in early 1947. Whoever went to the movies with any regularity during 1946 was caught in the midst of Hollywood's profound post-war affection for morbid drama. From January through December, deep shadows, clutching hands, exploding revolvers, sadistic villains, and heroines tormented with deeply rooted diseases of the mind flashed across the screen in a panting display of psychoneurosis, unsublimated sex, and murder most foul. Now, if Life magazine, in the year that All the King's Men wins the Pulitzer, is this focused on these films, even if they don't have the phrase film noir to label them yet, then the ethos, the attitude, the feelings and sentiment of film noir are very much on the public mind of Americans. Just as another critical metric, Life called All the King's Men the most exciting film to come out of Hollywood that year. Life wasn't in the vanguard, but it was always in the waiting room of the dentist. So as we think about the film's critique of populism, that might tell us something. In any case, All the King's Men won Best Picture in 1950, but by 1951, Rawson was on the blacklist and could not work in Hollywood until he named names in a closed-door session in 1953. He went back to work, but even then, his career didn't fully regain its footing until he made The Hustler in 1961. He died in 1966. If in 1964, Justice Potter Stewart knew obscenity when he saw it, or didn't in Louis Malle's film Les Allemands, HUAC and the self-preserving executives of Hollywood also seemed to know communism when it saw it in Hollywood films like All the King's Men, though what it was really looking at was a withering critique of the fragility of post-war democracy itself. Throughout the war, film studios had collaborated with the US government to produce films that would get American audiences comfortably situated right where they were needed ideologically. In 1941, Raoul Walsh directed Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland in They Died with Their Boots On for Warner Brothers, an historically irresponsible version of General George Armstrong Custer's last stand at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which was to get the public to feel good about losing, as the Allies then were, on the morally right side of the war. The following year, Warner Brothers also fast-tracked Casablanca, which, through its romance and intrigue in a far-flung location, enticed Americans to get behind the US military's ever-expanding commitment to the European and Pacific theaters. This is the same studio that Rawson excoriated for making Cinderella stories. Things looked different after the war, and All the King's Men shows it. As read by Hollywood, the problems are not merely beyond our borders, they are here. By this point in the weekend, I do not need to be the one to say much about Huey the Kingfish Long, the Louisiana governor and US senator who is the intertext for Willie Stark. But it is worth repeating that Long, the politician and master manipulator whose influence was so strong that he moved FDR to the left on his way to the 1936 election, one Long didn't live to see, was neither communist nor fascist, and in Rawson's hands, the figure of Willie Stark seemed to speak to the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of any clean political process. If Willie is quickly corruptible, the character of Adam Stanton, the pure-hearted doctor who is Jack's best friend, is the one who assassinates Stark, and no one emerges unscathed or undamaged. Stark's political leanings hew more to the platform of Bernie Sanders and to Long's own Share the Wealth plan than to Trump's. But it is hard to imagine a thinly veiled treatment of Sanders, including graft, laws so bent they are splintered, thugs beating his enemies to death, or a string of very public mistresses. That sounds more like someone else. When Trump famously remarked in the 2016 campaign that he loved the poorly educated, it was hard not to imagine Stark, even though he is clearly an excellent autodidact. But even Stark was never as transactional in his affections as Trump has been since long before he entered politics. This is partly to say that mapping books and films like All the King's Men onto current events takes the kind of work that the current president disdains and fears. Trump loves the poorly educated, but mistakenly, he does not count himself among them. Willie Stark is different. His transformational speech is, in Rawson's hands, one in which he folds himself into the Hicks he addresses. He is one of them, and this is the source of the power of his populism. If the film's aesthetic logic can be distilled to one passage, it might be this one, in which a hungover Stark realizes what role he has been assigned by the political establishment and mobilizes the citizenry to change the rules of the game. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will cue up that clip. A series of low-angle shots emphasizes Stark's rise to awareness and the transformation of that awareness to a rhetorical power that translates to political power. If we're not paying attention, we have the confirmation of Jack and Sadie looking on in admiration. And we have the extended crowd shots, a signature of Rawson's film, in which the magnitude of the populace that makes for the populism is laid out before the spectator in detail. This was at the time understood as a realism of high order, edging into documentary style. Rawson needed Clark and Parrish's editing skills to compress the shots of Willie Stark speechifying, literally now on fire with torches, into something cinematically sharp and persuasive. The images are all Rawson's, though we can see some antecedents in Sergei Eisenstein's Soviet montage classic October and Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. Later in the film, there will be a newsreel about Stark that will echo one in Citizen Kane. Both are there to compress a large amount of information and story into a short passage whose terms of address and reception the audiences of the time would have understood well. In the case of the newsreel in All the King's Men, mass media itself is under the microscope, and Rawson asks us to consider what the role of the media is in expanding and sustaining someone like Stark, or stopping him. Now that you have heard Broderick Crawford's oratory and you have heard no Bayou accent, this is a good time to mention that Rawson shifted the narrative from Louisiana to California and shot the film in Stockton. This is a significant shift that takes away the default understanding of a racialized United States in favor of one in which people of color appear merely as extras, none with speaking lines. Nevertheless, it is virtually impossible to produce an implicitly white story without evidence of some other kind of American subjectivity. Robert Penn Warren is more overt about this in his novel and uses the N-word on page 1. All the King's Men comes out the same year that HUAC name-namer Elia Kazan's Pinky, a drama about a Black woman who passes for white, was a critical and box office success. Rawson, who is in other films clearer about the wet knot of race in the United States, seems not to want to implicate Black characters in the swamp he produces. But as I hope I've begun to describe, Americans were going to the movies quite a lot in the late 1940s, and what audiences made of All the King's Men turned as much on what else they were seeing as on the film itself. Also in that stirring speech, Stark utters the famous phrase, "Those fellows in the striped pants," which is to say the men who put Willie up as a stooge. Striped pants become the sartorial yardstick by which we understand his fall. Striped pants come to mean something because Willie says they do. This film ponders beyond populism and asks whether even a progressive platform, such as Stark's, inevitably corrupts into neo-fascism when the populism goes authoritarian. It also asks what happens when the press is co-opted, when the reporter, Jack Burton, whose voiceover narrates the story, becomes something else when his services can be bought another way. It also considers the impossible position society and political discourse are in when the only options available are populist demagoguery and the machinations of the 1%, to put it a more contemporary spin on the denizens of Burton's Landing. To make this argument, we are not offered a pamphlet. We are offered relationships between and among characters. If it is a failure of this film that it displaces the political onto the personal, it's far from alone in classical Hollywood. If second-wave feminists suggested that the personal is political because every private issue was, in fact, imbricated in ideological and political systems, we're looking at its inverse here, as the capacity to engage with a political critique in a popular text runs up against the industrial demand that it must entertain us. It's impossible to disentangle the political ideas on offer from the romance and the desire of all kinds that are shot through this film. Jack loves Anne loves Jack, Willie loves his wife Lucy until he desires Anne, Sadie, and about a dozen fan dancers. Sadie loves Willie, and Anne's brother, Dr. Adam Stanton, loves decency until he doesn't. And we love the movies. Movies cannot do political work alone. They can only be the beginning of something, not its end. So I'll end where I began. Rawson wants us to be 1949 woke and activate ourselves as citizens. To get us fired up, he has to move us. The new realism that saturates the film is an alternative to Bertolt Brecht's distancing strategies, which are designed not to pull at heartstrings, but at intellects, which is, for the mainstream US audience then and now, typically not that much fun. Realism and alienation are both learned conventions of entertainment. Rawson may have been an ex-communist, and he may have had socialist leanings, to put it quaintly, but he worked knowingly in the capitalist system of classical Hollywood. So if I say that All the King's Men fails to activate viewers because it defaults to an emotional attachment endemic to almost all American films of the period, or ours, I also want to say that films can never solve problems on their own. It is what we do and what we are encouraged by films to do when we leave them that relies on our recourse to other media as well as to events like this one, where we can hold space for the kind of critical discourse that undergirds democracy, and I hope always will. Thank you.
We have a few questions. I was saying thank you. That was a splendid explication of a complicated subject. The first question is, between All the King's Men and making The Hustler, does Rawson always produce movies in his film noir style?
No, and I think I'm gonna overgeneralize for a minute here, but no one who is responsible for film noir stays that way unless they either stop working entirely, either because they stop working or they die. It really is like you know, almost every other style in Hollywood or in any national cinema. And those national cinemas, they exist in a global context. So of course they're talking to each other all the time. But film noir kind of peters out. You know, officially, I say officially as if there is such a thing, but you know, Touch of Evil in 1958 is sort of the end of it. And that's really at also close to the end of classical Hollywood. So film noir comes up during the war it kind of carries classical Hollywood through its studio phase, and then it dies out, not unlike the studio system itself. And then we have eventually, we have neo-noir, we have tech noir, and something like Blade Runner. So Rawson, when he comes back with The Hustler, I think because we know that Rawson was a noir maker, we might be looking for things in his later work, and they're probably there. And that's probably true about everybody. We've all got what we carry with us as creators. So that's not a very precise answer to the question, but I think it does take into account the way that people make films and in what context they make them, and the way that they're really porous, and they know they're doing some things and they don't know they're doing other things, and they pick up, Rawson knows exactly what he's doing with noir, but at some point it becomes second nature to him, so it may no longer be a decision after a certain point. It's just a kind of, not to evoke the great twitch, but it's a twitch.
Another question is, could you say a little bit more? Well, it's more of a comment than a question. We'd love to hear more about Mercedes McCambridge, who is a fascinating character.
Don't get me started. Don't get me started about Mercedes McCambridge. She's an absolutely extraordinary and really underused in Hollywood character. She started in theater, and then she was discovered is the wrong word, but Orson Welles came to understand that she existed, and he put her in his radio, the stable of radio actors that he had before he came to RKO to make movies. And so she was very clear about this, as she reflected on her career later on, was that vocal training was really crucial. And she would say later in life that one of the things she bemoaned was the way that actors, when they were being trained now, were not trained with the vocal training. They just didn't get it as much. And you can actually hear it, I think, really clearly in All the King's Men, when John Ireland as Jack Burton slaps her in the very intense scene that they have. It's the one I had a still of, where she's looking at herself in the mirror. And the way she responds to that is a kind of a vocal performance that you really have to have control to be able to do. And it was that control of her voice that I think was part of why she got the Oscar for this. I mean, getting Oscars means everything and nothing. But then one of the thing that most people nowadays know Mercedes McCambridge for is being the voice of the devil in The Exorcist. A role that when she went to the premiere, she was waiting for her credit, and it never came. There was no Mercedes McCambridge as the devil when the film premiered. I think subsequently they have fixed that, but her ability to manifest the devil was an entirely vocal performance. And she said it was just radio. And to do that, she was talk about method acting. She would do things to get certain things going in that film that were, I'm going to overstate it, but it was things like, nearly inhaling nuts and then swallowing raw eggs, and then, making sure that the sound design person was there to record the horrible retching sound that only that performed, that was the only way to get that. So she did it. But, what she did after All the King's Men, well, she did a lot of things, but the thing that I think resonates most for this discussion is when she played Emma Smalls, the villain against Joan Crawford's Vienna in Johnny Guitar, which is one of those films it's a Western, it's a melodrama Western hybrid, and it is entirely an allegory for the Red Scare. And Mercedes McCambridge plays a character who names names constantly. She's always dressed, John talked about The Crucible very briefly yesterday, but she's dressed like a pilgrim all the time, always in black and white, and always saying, it was her, it was you, it was him. And it's constantly naming names. And she knew, and she Nicholas Ray, everybody involved in it, most of them knew exactly what was happening. And a few of them had no idea at all. And they were mobilized exactly for that purpose.
Thank you very much. Another question, can you think of another example when a critically praised book becomes an equally critically praised film?
Well, it wasn't The Scarlet Letter. Can I think of one off the top of my head? Of course not, because you asked me the question and now my mind's a complete blank. But if anybody has thoughts about that, I mean, all right. Well, one that I think actually it's critically acclaimed, but not in the same way, is the Harry Potter series. I mean, that's probably not the answer you were looking for, but you know, the idea that there is this entire series of books that has absolutely shaped a generation and several generations after. And the films, you know, they exist both separately and together. And most of the and I say this because I have two 13-year-olds, you know, they treat those two things as both separate and intertwined. And they see, I'm actually looking through the chat and seeing To Kill a Mockingbird and Cuckoo's Nest, and you know, yeah, those are fantastic examples. You know, and they behave very differently because they are really, you know, books do one kind of thing and films do another. And you know, I said this at the beginning, there are irresponsible ways to move a book into cinematic space, but fidelity, I think, is not usually the thing. You know, there are other issues, I think, and just, you know, films, reading is such an intimate experience. And if you read the book first, as I, you know, always force my children to do, you know, then you go to the movie and you think, that's not how I imagined it. And so often that's the problem, is that the film has not imagined what your head imagined. What the images in your head are not the ones that the film is giving you. And you know, so I think that is part of it. But then the other thing is, particularly with a book and a film like this, is what kind of work is being done? What is it possible for a book to do? And what is it possible for a film to do? And so I think that is, you know, again, I will probably not give a very satisfactory answer on that one, because I'm more curious about their behaviors, and also their behaviors as they move across time. You know, I have to say, you have Bristol Book Fest has brought this film back into a kind of public consciousness at exactly the time that we needed it. You know, so I think there's a way of looking back on the history of films like this, and knowing that history, that means we all know where to go when we need something.
Well, that's a great answer. Thank you. One final question. What about Gone with the Wind?
What about Gone with the Wind? Well, you know, I think at this point, well, you know, what most of us probably know is that the book was so popular that the casting of the film was of enormous public interest. It was, so Clark Gable, okay, he didn't want it. He did not want that film. He was loaned out by Columbia to MGM to do that film, and he kicked and screamed all the way because he thought it would absolutely ruin his man's man image, and he was wrong. But then, you know, I mean, these are pretty easy to find, more than ever now that we have the large series of tubes that are the internet. But the screen tests for Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, for everybody read for Scarlett. And then casting Vivien Leigh was something that a lot of people, partly because they had no idea who she was, you know, this is a terrible idea. And of course it wasn't, you know, and so I think the power of that film, as a film, that was beloved by people as a book, was started with the casting. And so, you know, I think now we look back and think, well, the film has lasted more in public consciousness, in a very, you know, mainstream way than the book has. But you know, both of them, obviously, the way we have conversations about either of those texts is very different now.
Here's one, see if you can answer it in 1 minute, because we're about to run out of time. Are there any parallels between All the King's Men and Citizen Kane, other than what you mentioned visually?
Lots, I think.
The interview,
yes.
The newsreel thing.
Absolutely. So there's the humble beginnings of Charles Foster Kane and Willie Stark, and there's the, you know, and then there's the overreach, right? And there's the way that he spends people. All, you know, both of those characters spend people all the way down the line, and then are fundamentally, you know, Kane, we see this much more clearly than Stark, but they both die alone in different kinds of ways, but they both sort of die alone because they have spent their human relationships in favor of something else. And for Cain, it's power and wealth, and for Stark, well, for Cain it's wealth and power, and for Stark it's power and wealth. But I think that they are very, very similar stories, absolutely, in that way.
Another great answer. I think we all wish we were Smith students taking her classes. So on that note, thank you so much. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll see you tomorrow, Alex, at the for the panel discussion.
Thank you all very much.